when it comes to basically rebuilding web pages, the best way you can go about it is trying to structure it in such a way that you understand. You try to like build sections off of each other. This actually will be a lot more understandable when you guys go into React, but the basic mentality is that you kind of build the major structures first and then you kind of fill it in, right? So if you guys open up your repository and then you basically agree with a blank index.html, you have a page.jpg here. I'm just going to put this on the bottom as reference constantly. Cool. And essentially what we're tasked to do is just recreate this. So obviously we first create an HTML file, right? If you guys are confused about any of the shortcuts I take at this point, feel free to ask. The idea is that I just put an exclamation mark. So I'll just recreate it. I'll put an exclamation mark, and because it's an HTML file, it'll automatically fill out the details. Okay, cool. This is called a file called document, and then you have a body tag here. So just for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to call it hello. And then I'm also going to click on this button right here, which is a live server. Basically, this will create a live server where we can basically, if we ever hit the save button, like that. Cool. So let's just say hello, my name. If I hit save, it'll automatically update, right? So this is a live server extension, essentially. So just keep that in mind, chat. Can I zoom in a bit? Sure. Zoom in specifically where? To the code or to the file?
Maybe on the code.
On the code? Yeah, sure, no worries.
Yeah, it's the projector.
Does he have the top load or is that just the projector?
My bad. That's all good. Okay. I'll just get rid of that. I don't need that. All right. Cool. Okay. So when I say we want to create the major structures, or like say like the main template for which we want to kind of recreate this, let's actually just like look at this and then see what we can do with that. So in Paint, I'm just going to open up Paint because this is the easiest way I can do this. Let me see if I can find the file first. 6080. Okay, website. Okay, what I mean by recreating the major sections, what I'm going to do first is that I can clearly notice that there's a big rectangular section up here. And then there's also a separate rectangular section up here. So I'm just going to create two rectangles topped on top of each other, stacked on top of each other, right? And then placed right next to each other. Okay. The dimension of this whole container is 1896 by 870. So let's just start doing something similar to that. So I'm first going to create a div, and I'm going to call the ID container. Cool. And then in this container, I'm going to contain two rectangles, right? So let's just go, or two sections here. So let's just call this main content section because this is the place where all the main content will be. Yep. Div, cool. And then we'll put another div right here, and we'll call this footer. Right. So this is just us separating these two sections into each other, right? And just to really show it off, I'm just going to call this main content, and I'm just going to call this footer. Cool. If I save the file, you can clearly see that we create two divs. So main content and footer on top of each other. Obviously, it doesn't look like this yet, but we're going to try style it such that it looks like that. Okay. From there, we want to kind of create a style tag. We want to create a style sheet. So we're going to use link. Actually, if we type in link itself, they actually give you an option for CSS. So if you type in link and then CSS, it'll automatically kind of fill in the dots for you. In this case, they want you to create a style.css file. So we'll quickly do that. File style.css. Cool. And then I'm basically going to be jumping back and forth between index and .html and style.css to stylize my sheets. Okay. French. I don't know what the hell's French for. All right, cool. First things first, since we did just contain, we have an overarching div called container. We want to actually contain all of this page within that container. So if that's the case, again, for IDs, make sure you always put a hash. What should be the height and width? What should be the height and width of this container? If this is the container that's containing the entire page. Feel free to just unmute or type in the chat. Remember, if there are 2 times the amount of messages in this chat, then there are people here as well. I'll give you more details about assignment 1. So I really need you guys to hopefully engage. You guys okay? The size of the viewport / image given. Exactly. Basically, if you actually go on your VS Code and you actually load it up, you can see on the bottom right here where they actually give you the size of the whole image. In this case, we have an 1896 by 870 image, right? So we just model it off of that, right? So it's 870 pixels. And width will be 1896 pixels. Give me 1 second. Sorry, it's a bit hot in my room right now. Cool. And just to really reiterate this, I'm just going to give it a background color of, let's say, blue, and just see what that actually does. So as you can see here, if I zoom out, it's actually creating this 1896 by 870 pixel high div, right? That's completely covered in blue. So this is basically what we have to do. We basically just have to translate all of this page into the space that we have. Okay. The reason why I also like to do this bit by bit and then color things in background colors of blue is just because front end is a very visual kind of programming, where if I can visually see what the things I'm doing are actually contributing to the web page, it makes it a lot easier for me to just like progress from there. For front end, it can be a bit intimidating, I would say, if you just completely looked at a website bare. For example, if you just looked at something like this, and then you were just asked to basically interpret that, mainly because I think for when you're building up front end, it's kind of like layered complexity. It initially starts off extremely basic, and then it gets more and more progressively complex the more you add to it. And I think by doing it that mentality, you can kind of see how more complex pages are built. So like I said before, this is the container, and then the background color is blue. So that's obviously confirming that we are in the right. Just to really reiterate this, I'm just going to go 1 pixel solid black. Just a quick question. Why did you firstly check the dimensions in MS Paint and VS Code as opposed to doing everything in VS Code? Okay, cool. So Paint, I'm actually just using this as a visual tool, but it'll actually be useful later on to position specific elements. For example, let's say I want to know how many pixels this text right here is from the side, right? I can use the select tool, and I can see on the bottom right here that it's 275 pixels from the left side, right? Since we obviously have a CSS attribute called padding left, I can actually know roughly exactly where that text needs to be from the left side of the pixel. Just for the main dimensions, yeah, I can just use VS Code. And in fact, I use VS Code as a means to just constantly refer to the page I'm looking at. But later on, if I want exact details, which, you know, given that you guys have to do assignment 1, where sometimes you have to be a bit pedantic with the pixels and stuff like that, I like to use Paint, or we use Photopea as well, but Paint's pretty good enough for this simple aspect. Simple page. Okay, cool. Now, obviously, I want main content to be covering like roughly like 60% of the page, and then footer to be covering like maybe 10-15%. How to use it in Mac? Oh, okay. If you gotta use Mac, maybe you might have to use Photopea or an equivalent Paint service tool in Mac. Photopea is an online tool that's basically like Photoshop essentially. And then you can basically drag the image in there, and then you can kind of like measure the pixels off of that. So I'll just quickly show you off. So drag into here. Cool. And then see this select tool as well. Let's see if I drag in. Zoom in, please. It's Z. Yep. Cool. So I want to know how many pixels there are. So I'm just going to quickly make this full screen because this makes it easier for us. Okay, cool. If I just use the select tool, see, as you can see here, it says width 270 pixels or height 276 pixels. So you can kind of determine it from there. So that's an online tool that you can use. It's very useful. Honestly, I probably recommend using Photopia over Paint. Only just Paint is just quicker for me to kind of like work off of and just easier for me to show off. But yeah, you can use that. Are we able to connect the GitLab account after configuring our personal? Anything regarding GitLab, you probably need to message Hayden about it. There's been some really weird behaviors with GitLab recently, and I think Hayden has been answering that. Okay, cool. I'll answer the other questions later on after just doing the first demonstrations. But okay, so we have obviously our main content and footer. And if we remember from our index.html, I separate them into two separate divs. The reason why we're going to do that is because we actually want our container to be a flex, right? In the sense that we want them to be kind of formatted in such a way that they're right on top of each other. So if I put this as display flex, right, and then I do flex direction column, what this is going to do is that it's basically going to display this. Well, by default, it's already in column, but what it's going to do is going to place this div on top and then this div on bottom, basically. If I do it on column, if I do it on row, it's going to be right next to each other, like so, right? The best way I can probably show this actually is, let's put a CSS tag on the content. Let's give it a border. Actually, no, let's give it a background color of, let's say, blue. And then let's do for footer, the background color is red. Okay. So you can clearly see on a row, it's actually like stacked next to each other, like acting like columns. And then if you do a column, you can see that they're stacked on top of each other, right? This is some of the behaviors you can play with Flex. Specifically, if you want to know more about Flexbox, I recommend just looking up Flexbox. And then the first link right here is a complete guide to CSS Flexbox. They give you good examples about how to use it, as well as some images in order to follow the steps. Another thing you can also do if you really just want to test your skills is just do Flexbox Froggy. It is a really helpful kind of like little game that allows you to clarify your understanding of Flexbox itself. It is a very, very powerful tool, one that you'll be commonly using throughout the rest of the term. So it's one that I highly recommend you guys learn. Okay, cool. Okay, so now that this is basically looking somewhat similar to this, we still want the whole percentages to be accurate, when the main content is covering maybe like 80% and then the bottom is covering 20%. This is where we can actually use our pixel measurements of sorts. So I can actually determine the height of this by looking over here. And I can see that the height is about 200 pixels, right? So if I said that the footer is height 200 pixels, what it's going to do is that it's going to create this footer and it's going to create this 200 pixel size right here. The problem is right now is that our main content isn't filling the rest of the image essentially, right? So what I can do is if I type in flex1, flex1 basically tells the flex object, the div object, which is inside the container, right? That fill in the remaining space, right? Any remaining space you have, fill it in. If I both put this as flex1, what it's going to do is that it's going to say, okay, in this ratio of each being both 1, I'm just going to equal it out. So both will have equal space. Another thing you can do, for example, let's say make content 2 and then the other one's 1. So obviously footer has 1/3 of the space, whereas main content has 2/3 of the space. Yeah. So this is something that you can also use. But in this case, since I know what the height of the footer is going to be, I'm going to put that as 200 pixels, and then the main content will fill in the rest of the space. Yeah. Is anyone confused yet, or anyone have any questions regarding that? Cool. Yeah, any admin questions, I'll just answer at the end, just specifically, but cool. All right, so I'm not officially done yet. I need to recreate this image of this woman and put it in this section, in the main content section here. And then I also need to have the footer a different color. So let's find out what that color is. Again, I can use Paint. Again, Photopia does a really good job of doing this as well, but I can just do Paint, and then I can see right here, it's 251, 211, and 1. So I can do background color is RGB, 251, 211, and 1, right? And then again, save it, see if it's actually working, right? Whenever you make a change, it's always a good idea to just quickly save it, check it if it's actually working as intended, and then move on to the next step, right? That way you don't get overwhelmed and you're actually progressively getting to the final product. Okay, Now this background image is specifically found in assets right here. Cool. Can anyone tell me what CSS tag I can use in order to place this image as the background? As well as the current step, the steps for it. The current settings for it, sorry. Message. Okay, cool. Background image. Good. Background image or just background URL. Good. Yeah. Basically, you can just do background image or background URL. URL is basically taking a. You can either plug in an an actual link, like a web link, or in this case, you can actually supply it with a directory. So in this case, let's do assets/exercise2 landing page. Okay, and let's just save that and see what happens. Now, this is a good step, but right now you can clearly see that the woman's glasses are already covering to the edge. Yet in this photo, we want it to be within the page, right? So, well, at least within the home page. So what we can do is that instead of for position, oh, sorry. Let's see. For background image, background attachment. Yeah, I think it's background cover, if I'm correct. Sorry, just give me a second. You want to specifically, yeah, background size. You want specifically to actually fill in the entire thing. So in this case, it would be background size. Background size being a 10. Cool. And then you can give it the attribute cover. So as you can see here, basically what background size cover does is that it automatically adjusts the image you put in and then kind of fits it into the space that you want it to. Right? So yeah, this is basically the first steps you take in order to finish to basically replicate the web page. You take the main structures first, and then you kind of recreate that, and then you start slowly, working on each system. So in this case, after we've basically set out the layout, we can start working on the main content. Now in the main content, we can clearly see that we have bank safely online from anywhere, a button that looks like that's in the same color as this that says explore products. And then we have the SVG right here. That doesn't load right now, but we'll see it later. As long as we've got your back, see what we're doing about fraud, right? We'll be basically putting all of that now into the main content, and we'll completely ignore the footer because again, we don't need to worry about the footer. We've already set it up as a separate div, and we can worry about that later. But for now, let's just work in the main content. Okay. You want to put probably bank safely online from anywhere in H1 tag, mainly because this is a heading and it's big letters. So bank safely online from anywhere. Again, once you save it, look at what it does, right? Currently, we want that to be in white. So let's just start working on that. Main content, H1. So another way you can reference tags within divs is that you can basically put the ID of the div that you have and then a tag following it, essentially. Okay, so in this case, any H1 under the main content tag, right, will have these attributes. In this case, let's just set the color to be right. Okay, cool. Judging from the font, let's just actually let all the font be the same. So in this case, I'm going to take the body tag, and then I'm just going to have the font family be, I think, sans serif. Yeah, sans. Cool. So that looks roughly the same font. Okay, cool. And then basically, we want to adjust the size of this text to kind of match the size of this one. When it comes to recreating web pages, I will say this, it is much faster to get the structure of it first and then get the, I guess, pedantic pixel matching of it later on, right? Try not to ever like match it exactly at the beginning where it takes a lot of time to match it. Font size, anything regarding font will take a long time. That's just in its nature, essentially, mainly because there's a lot of CSS attributes that can affect it. There's line height, letter spacing, you can transform it if you really wish to. But the idea mainly is to just recreate the layout of this page and then just like adjust it from there, right? Because that because getting the main structure out of the way first will obviously lead to a better structure site. Okay, so let's see, font size, let's say 6 rem and see what happens there. Okay, cool. As you can clearly see, this text is going like beyond her hair, which is not great. So let's just try to have it such that it's only within bank and safely. I can actually adjust the width of this H1 to be within some width. So let's just say 550 pixels. Yeah, see? Okay, so now this is replicating what this looks like. Now, the thing is, I need to also make sure that the text is a certain distance from the left. So let's see. Actually, if we can also notice, there's also a bit of a pattern here. You can kind of see that all elements within the main content all have a fixed kind of padding from the left, essentially. So instead of actually adjusting just H1, I can actually probably put within the main content div a padding left. So this padding left div is about 270 pixels wide. So again, instead of worrying about H1, because all elements are kind of to the left there, let's just put hashtag main content. Let's just put a padding left for 270 pixels. Cool. And now we'll literally adjust any element within main content 270 pixels to the left. Now we can also see that bank safe H1 kind of already put some padding at the top or margin at the top. I think you guys have learned how to kind of like read into the actual doc through through the web page, through Chrome essentially. And then you can kind of like get access to this where you can actually see what's being shown and what's being displayed. So in this case, I'm going to quickly look at my header. And as you can clearly see, if you can kind of see the color coding, the orange is basically your margins. If you really want to see a better view of that, you can look at the box model on the bottom right here, where the main content is located right here. And then you can clearly see that there are margins of 64.32 on top and bottom. This is just auto-generated because of the H1 tag specifically. But if I wanted to get rid of that and I just wanted to specify my own, what I can do is I can override the margin top. So I can say like margin top is 10 pixels instead of 60.3. And you can clearly see that it'll go on top. But the problem is that it'll still maintain the 64.32 pixels on the bottom. So if you just want to fully customize where this H1 tag will be, I suggest just setting all the margins to be 0 pixels and then kind of like adjusting from there. So then that way margin top can be like 20 pixels, but then margin bottom can be 90 pixels, for example. And that way you have complete control over where the position of the element is. Okay. Again, I'm just going to roughly estimate how far from the top the H1 tag is. So in this case, this is about 58 pixels from the top. So let's just put 55 pixels. You might be wondering why I didn't exactly put 58 pixels. One, I just quickly checked on Paint how far that was. And two, fonts don't necessarily start at the top of, say, like the B, for example. Sometimes they have spacing within its own space. And you kind of just have to account for that, essentially. But again, this is one of those things where you just get rough estimates about where it is, and then you can adjust later on by doing some comparison. But yeah, does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, if not, can anyone tell me what we want to model this Explore products as? So what kind of, within, again, main content div, what kind of attribute do we want to maybe use in order to model this Explore products? What does it look like? Perhaps a button. Exactly. Good. Button is a it basically looks like a button that you can click on and it'll send you to another link. So let's just model it as a button. Explore products. The cool thing about HTML is that basically anything that kind of like looks like default, you can basically change all of its attributes. So even though Explore products looks nothing like this right now, we can adjust it later to make it look like that. Okay, so we're just going to go do that right now. In fact, we'll call this ID Explore products button. Cool. Okay, and then within main content, I'm just going to put another ID called Explore products. And then again, I'm just gonna play around with it a bit. Let's just say like font size is 2 rem and then see if it changes that. Good, it changes it. So therefore we set up everything in HTML correctly. Okay, the background color is basically the same as the footer. So I'm just gonna grab that. And I'm just gonna copy that here. Cool. Cool. And then we can clearly see the button is in the background like that. Nice. Let's see. We can also determine what the height and the width of the button is. So again, just using any editing photo editing service, just quickly check. So it's about 5960 pixels high. So let's just do that. Height pixels, and then width is about just roughly 320 pixels. Cool. And if I go back on the top, it kind of looks, it's starting to look like that. Okay, so there's also a bit of a shadow here generated from the border itself. So I'm just going to quickly get rid of the border. So none. And then that will remove the shadow that's generated from the border itself. And one other thing that we need to also do is that we need to make it curved on the edges, right? There is a property that can do that. Does anyone know what attribute that would be? It's right there. Sugar. Yeah, cool. Border radius, right? And then again, you just play around with it until it kind of like looks decent enough. Yeah, that looks pretty good on its own. And finally, we probably just want to bold this because the picture looks bolded itself. So we just do font weight and we just say bold. Cool. Okay. Again, we're just trying to get the main things out of the way. You can adjust later on how far this Explore Products button is from Bank Online Safety by, again, just adjusting margin bottom. So if I change this to 60 pixels, this will move up, right? But again, we're just going to get the main structure out of the way before we start pedantically kind of looking into the finer details. Okay, cool. Now that we got this button out of the way, let's get the clause. Let's get this clause out of the way. So obviously we have what seems to be our SVG file of, I think, a Defender kind of icon. So if I just do assets / draw to icon, cool. Again, I'm just going to do that and then save. You can clearly see it just broke our website. And that's because the SVG file itself is so huge that it's basically kind of overtaking the entirety of the website. Let me see. Yeah, it looks like this essentially, which obviously just broke everything. So in order to do that, let's just actually adjust the size of that. Let's see. Since it's the only image, I can probably just get away with just doing the same thing with H1 here. Since, again, this is the only image tag we used in the main content, I can probably get away with just doing identify main content and then the image within the main content div. And let's just actually change that height to, like, let's say 40 pixels, 50 pixels, and then it'll automatically adjust from there. And then see, we already got a better product from that. Another thing we should note as well is actually this hasn't been entered. So just put it here. And then we can place that here, and then that should actually put it right below it. Cool. You might be wondering why I put a div instead of a p tag or a br tag. Mainly speaking, p tags are kind of just used for text only. Br tags can be used, but they're really inefficient. And anything, honestly, you can do with a p tag or a br tag, you can just do with a div tag and then just some CSS. It gives you a lot more flexibility, and it also allows you to like put less code on the actual HTML. Cool. So now we have this div, and then obviously we just got to put some text here within this div. Let's just call this clause. Cool. And then let's just put the text here. So we've got your back. See what we're doing about. Okay. One thing to know as well is that see what we're doing about fraud is underlined. So that's another thing you need to make sure you put in. You could put some styling like in CSS to do that, but instead I'm just going to use the U tag. Cool. might be wondering when we would use a U tag or when we use CSS. Honestly, when it's just like one small change that you need to make to the main page, just probably go with the tag that you feel like will produce the least lines of code essentially. In this case, I don't really need to say in clause specifically and then just change this to a specific div or span. And then basically give it the text decoration tag. Instead, I'm just going to use the U tag and that should be good enough. Okay, cool. It's starting to look like it, but we obviously need to do some styling. So I'm just going to put this over here and zoom in a bit. Cool. Let's see, main content image. Actually, let's just call this clause now. Clause tag. Cool. If we go with the clause itself, we're going to make the color of the text white. Cool. And then we're going to make the font size maybe 2 rem for now, maybe 1 rem. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Now, obviously, there are some differences between this and our current page right here. As you can see right here, the SVG file or the I'm just going to call it the Defender icon is actually slightly below or like in line, so to speak, with We've Got Your Back, right? There are ways to go about this. One, you could separate these two into 2 separate divs and then put a flex box around it, or we can use the position tag, which I would prefer in this case. So the position tag allows us to actually change the position of the image with respect to its original position if we set it in a specific way. For the online, wouldn't matter if we use the anchor tag. Yeah, it kind of does, because like if someone read your code and then saw an anchor tag, they're actually kind of expecting a link, essentially. And it's one of those things where you're not only designing code so that someone is looking at the web page and think it's pretty. You're also designing the code such that other coders, in this case, other people who are also coding front end, can understand what you're trying to convey. Right? Because if you put an anchor tag for someone who's working front end, they're going to wonder, okay, does this link to something, or does this end up somewhere? So your choice of tags is actually very important because again, it's supposed to also convey meaning in some way. It's very subtle, and honestly, I think you need more experience, more practice with it, and when you start noticing it, because there's actually also multiple ways to approach a lot of different problems. Case in point, like instead of using flex, I could have used grid for this and it would have done the same thing. But again, it's just a matter of like, okay, in that case, it's a really bad example because both do the same thing without any consequences. Let me think. I could, instead of using H1, I could have just used, normal text and then I gave it a different ID. But again, that doesn't really give you a good convey. It's like if someone just read your code, right? And they'll be like, okay, when they read the text file, that's not H1, right? They think it's just normal text, right? But on the actual web page itself, it looks like a heading, essentially. So your choice of tags is very important because it not only conveys, again, information to the coder, but it's also supposed to make your code look neater. And it's actually something maybe look into when we are marking you guys, your correct choice of tags and stuff like that. Okay, cool. So yeah, we've got your back, see what you're doing about fraud, and then we want to change where the Defender icon is basically, right? So one of the tags we can use is position relative, or position, and then we use relative. Now there are multiple, I guess, attributes that could be assigned to position. In this case, we're just going to use relative. Relative basically changes the position of the item with respect to where it should be, right? If I used absolute, basically, I can give it an absolute location where it'll always be. For example, if I say 10 pixels from the right, 10 pixels from the top, it will always be there, no matter where you're on the page, right? But in this case, I'm going to use relative because I actually want it to be respect to its original position, essentially, right? And then if I give it if I give a top of 30 pixels, so in this case, it will be like, okay, change your position 30 pixels from the top, essentially. Move down from the top by 30 pixels. Okay, that was too much, but you get the idea. We want it to be in line with this. And actually, we kind of want to make this smaller. Probably 10 pixels. Cool. And yeah, that's basically it. Again, we've just recreated this main content section. Again, obviously this text is not matching with what we're seeing here, but we're getting the main structure out of the way, right? We can do the changes to how it looks later on specifically, but the main core of it is just we're getting the main content position in the right places so we can adjust it later much easier. Okay, cool. And that's the main content section. So does anyone have any other questions so far? Margin bottom, 20 pixels. Cool. Just gonna give it some space. And then something I can adjust later. Okay. Like I said before, since we now dealt with the main content page, we obviously have this footer section right here that's just been laying here and doing nothing. And again, we can kind of like work with separate sections independent of each other. Like nothing in this main content section should affect the bottom section essentially, or the footer, right? Anyways, so now that we have the footer, we probably want to start writing some of the stuff out. So we have $0 fee. And then we have a 1 here and a dot. Okay, cool. And then we also have open an everyday account, transaction account with us, and keep what? Keep the change. Okay, cool. So we have our text right here. And now we just got to basically format it such that it looks like what seems to be in the center of the page. Okay. Does anyone have any ideas about how we can do that? Let's just take this text right now and just put it at the center between these two. Does anyone have any idea how we can do that? Remember, we have a footer tag right here, and we have our options of using flex, our other CSS properties, etc. Does anyone have any clues or any suggestions of how we can just place this content right here in the center? Margin auto. Yeah, you can do that. You can margin auto will actually adjust from the left and right specifically, if I'm correct. Margin auto. Yeah, but it'll also adjust any of the contents within it, unfortunately. So that's something also to consider. We could set the width to be 100%. But yeah, text align center. Yep, that's also something that we can also do. Text align center. Cool. And again, that just kind of allocates it to the center of the actual object. You're on to something though. The thing is that when it comes to Flexbox, you can actually justify the content and then align items. And then that basically adjusts where the element is with respect to horizontally and vertically. I can show you what I mean by this. So this, let's call this display and let's give it a flex property, right? So instead of text align, I'm going to do align items center. And what this is going to do is it's going to align all the items vertically into the center, right? And then if I do justify content center, it's going to change all the elements within, again, the footer, and then it's just going to adjust it to the center like so. Yeah. So this is how we can basically kind of like put everything at the center and make it look, like the page essentially. Okay, cool. I'm just going to give this a H2 tag because this looks like an H2 tag. And save that right here. Again, I'll adjust the H2 tag later. One thing that we have to probably address is the fact that this one right here is obviously a superscript. So there actually is a tag called superscript, sup essentially. And we can place it here and then it looks like that right here. So as you can clearly see, it's starting to replicate what this looks like. And again, we're just trying to replicate it as close as possible. So within footer, let's go hashtag footer. Cool. And let's change the size of this. Let me see, font size. Let's say 4rem. Did I make too big? Oh no, I didn't. This will do better. This will be better to adjust. Cool. Yeah, that looks relatively right. The thing is that the superscript will actually adjust its size depending on the H2 tag itself. So since I set it to 4rem, it will actually create the superscript to be larger. I can actually change the size of the superscript itself. So again, superscript is just tagged, so I can just make it font size, let's say 0.5 rem. Is that too small? That might be too small. Yeah, that's way too small. 1 rem, 1.3. Yeah, 1.3. I don't know. And again, you don't have to be too exact. You can be exact much later on. But yeah, cool. We just recreated this. Another thing to keep in mind is that there's some distance between the header to tag and the normal script. So we can actually use our margins. Let's just say margin right 50 pixels. And then, as you can see here, we create some distance between open everyday transaction account with us and then this. Cool. Let's see if I can actually adjust something. Cool. Another thing we can actually do is that we can actually adjust all the font within footer and then not worry about H2, because again, the hashtag footer H2 will actually override any of the settings we put in hashtag footer. So I can change the font or font properties in footer without worrying about changing this. So let's just say font. So let's make the font weight bold. Make sure that that's working good. And then let's just put the font size. Let's say 2 rem. Oh, 1.5 rem. Cool. And as you can see right here, what we have right now is an almost replica of the page we want to actually copy. Okay. The key is always like, again, we just want to create an almost copy and then we can minorly adjust it from there to actually match it. Right. And as you can clearly see, it started off very basic. You know, we had just main content and a footer, and we just wanted to make sure that the ratios were correct. But now we've kind of expanded it up to the point where we basically almost copied, again, the main page. Cool. So what we've learned is basically just make sure, again, you kind of, whenever you're approaching these kind of like recreate website pages, just break it off into sections first. Get one section out correctly. You know, use color coding if you want, color the sections in background colors that you feel comfortable, such that it's really easy for you to discern that the ratios are correct. And then just work on each section independently, bit by bit, right? Obviously, I've gone a bit fast because I'm a bit more experienced with some of the attributes and aspects. And if anything, I actually really recommend you just experiment with all the different attributes that you can, because this is only just one way of approaching this page, but we really welcome the idea that there are multiple endless ways of how you can approach building a web page. So if you found something about if you found something that worked for you, feel free to do so. What do you mean by sorry? How about the font specifically? Actually, let me see how many messages have been. 1, 2, 3. But yeah, so that's basically the question. Does anyone have any other questions? Does anyone have any questions regarding the exercise itself? Font type. Okay, so font type is really, really picky. I don't really know the exact answer to this, mainly because most of the time in any of these questions, they give you the font. If you want to actually discern where this font comes from, you might have to do the manual visual approach. I'm actually not exactly too sure if there's an application out there right now that allows you to determine what font it is based off of an image. Because yeah, that is something that's like kind of like up in the air, so to speak. Luckily for assignment 1, again, we give you specifically what font families to use for whatever question. Even though it may not look like sometimes the font family does not look like the actual question itself, we're perfectly fine to accept the font family you choose, so long as it's the one we gave you.